Hello, my name is Joseph Greenlee, and this is the second in a series of videos in which I will be interviewing authors about their Second Amendment scholarship. Today, I am honored to be joined by Stephen Halbrook. Steve is an attorney in Virginia and a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. For roughly 50 years, he has been among the most influential Second Amendment scholars and litigators. Steve is 3-0 in cases that he has argued before the United States Supreme Court. He has numerous other legal victories, and he is the author of 11 books and over 70 scholarly articles and book chapters. Today, we will be discussing Steve's newest book, America's Rifle, The Case for the AR-15. And thank you very much, Steve, for joining us.
Glad to be on the newly launched show, and I look forward to seeing many more.
Thank you. So my first question, really this book, and again, here it is. I'll share a link in the description so people can buy it if they're interested. It's called America's Rifle, The Case for the AR-15. And really it's about a category of firearms. These are sometimes called assault weapons, sometimes called modern sporting rifles, and sometimes called AR type rifles. What do you think what's your preferred terminology?
Well, they're simply semi-automatic rifles of a particular design. Most commonly, they go by AR-15 or AR-15 type. The term assault weapon is a propagandistic term. It's a total misnomer. Modern sporting rifle fits the description because that's what they are. They're mostly used for sporting purposes. If you go to any target range around the country, you're going to see them. They're also useful for self-defense. So they're way out there in society.
Oh, you write that, and we'll get to my next questions about the term assault weapon and where that comes from. But first, you write that assault rifle is a military term. Where does that term come from, and what does that mean?
Well, one of the best sources of military terms and descriptions of military weapons was a book by Harold Johnson, Small Arms Operations Guide. There's one volume is Eurasian communist countries, and the other one is free world countries. Hal Johnson was a friend of mine, but and this was published by the Defense Intelligence Agency. It's an official military publication. But anyway, an assault rifle is a selective fire weapon, meaning that you can select either semi-auto or full auto to fire it, and it uses an intermediate cartridge, not a large, more powerful cartridge like the old 30-06 or 308. It uses a 5.56 or 223 cartridge. So it's not a very powerful cartridge, and it's not even legal for deer hunting in many states. But that's what an assault rifle is. That's the military definition, and that's the correct definition.
Well, the term assault weapon really started appearing in the 80s. Where did that come from?
So there's an organization called Violence Policy. What is it? Group organization center, Violence Policy Center. There's so many of these groups, and they change their minds frequently. But that's a gun prohibitionist group. They want to ban firearms, whatever types they can, and their focus originally was handguns, and then they discovered, well, these rifles are being made that look like an M16 military rifle. So why don't we create a new term that we can use for propaganda and confuse the public? And so they came up with the term assault weapon. Josh Sugarman was the name of the individual who authored a report arguing for that, and it explicitly said that this is a useful term to use because the public is confused, and basically we can take advantage of that confusion. People think that that they're banning automatic weapons, which have been highly restricted since 1934, but nobody's going to know the difference.
The courts have upheld bans on AR type rifles based on the reasoning that they're most useful in military service. How commonly used are AR type rifles in military service?
They're not. The courts that have said that have overlooked the fact, and it was brought to their attention, no military force in the whole world issues a semi-automatic rifle as its service weapon. The U.S. military, the M16 or M4, different renditions of those. And if you go to previously Soviet bloc countries, it was the Kalashnikov designs, AK-47, AK-74, and variants and descendants of those. Go to France, Britain. Nobody's using semi-automatic rifles to issue to their military forces. So the courts that say that um, they just make it up, and they know because I know the briefing goes to them showing that these rifles are not used by any military in the world, and they never cite any evidence that they are.
So they're not used by militaries. Are they used by civilians? How commonly possessed are these type AR type rifles by American citizens?
Well, it's the most commonly possessed, I would say, center fire rifle. There may be more 22 caliber rifles possessed by civilians than any other kind, but in terms, like maybe the Ruger 10/22, but in terms of typical center fire rifles, the highest production is going to AR-15 types, and that's been going on for many decades. I think I'm not good memorizing statistics, but maybe 25 million. Am I right about that? Yeah, I think I've got it in my book, but I can't remember all these numbers. I mean, so they're commonly possessed by law-abiding people for lawful purposes. If you read the anti-gun propaganda, they'll say things like, well, only criminals would want these guns. But get this, I mean, every gun, when it's first sold at retail by a federally licensed firearm dealer, that person had a background check. And what a way to slander and defame your fellow citizens than to say that they're all criminals because they bought this rifle. I mean, it's a fine target weapon. It's got excellent accuracy. It's doesn't have much recoil, so it's good for youth training. It's good for smaller statue persons, for females, and typically the latest designs, the stock is adjustable so it can fit sizes of different people. So it's just a wonderful firearm.
And I think the latest numbers I see, although I could be wrong about this, I think it's up to about 20, over 28 million. So extremely commonly owned. And you had a statistic in your book that was surprised me a little until I thought about it, and then it made sense. But it's a quote directly from a study, but it says of the people who hunted with a center fire rifle in 2021, 60% used an AR type rifle, which
Also, it's a very interchangeable type weapon system. So there are barrels in like 7.5, 308, all of the higher caliber hunting cartridges. There are barrels that are available. So although it's used for small game hunting, varmint hunting, things like that, and maybe the smaller caliber like 223, you can get them in these high power rifle designs. It's a very multi-caliber adaptable rifle, which is another reason why it's so popular. You can use it for so many different things.
so I guess we should get into what features make something an AR type rifle. So under the statutes that typically ban these rifles, what are the features that they focus on?
And okay, I'm going to start with the reality. A typical AR rifle has a pistol grip that's under the action, and it's a pistol grip that you can wrap your hand around so you can grasp it firmly, as opposed to the older style rifles where you're holding the rifle with your hand and the thumb is up there um, against the top part of the stock, but it doesn't go around and grasp the stock like with the AR design. So that's why they call it a pistol grip. Um, but the definitions of so-called assault weapon by the states that prohibit them, they're really all over the place. One typical definition is that it has a and I don't want to scare anybody, but these terms are very shocking. It's a pistol grip that protrudes conspicuously beneath the action. I mean, you can just see the horror of it. You know, to say that's a feature that makes people, that it's designed to hold it at the hip and mow people down. What a fantasy world. Okay, here's where the Tower of Babel comes in, though. So, okay, that's one typical definition. If you go to Cook County, Illinois, so that first definition assumes it has a shoulder stock because it says a rifle with this conspicuously protruding pistol grip. But if you go to Cook County, some people call it Crook County. Um, it it's a semi-automatic weapon that has a protruding pistol grip but no stock. So there you have opposites. You have one with a stock, one with no stock. And then if you go to the Maryland law, that feature is not even mentioned. And so it's like it's hard to find words for this lunacy. And so then there's other definitions under the old federal ban that expired. It had a bayonet lug. I mean, that's something that a lot of people are killed with bayonets. Well, yeah, if we want to turn the clock back to the Civil War, okay. Not since then. But anyway, if it had just that little stud on it, that made it an assault weapon feature. And then you've got the features that make the rifle more efficient, more safe. Um, I mean, isn't it the case that we want when we fire a firearm, we want it to hit the target most efficiently? And so, like the adjustable shoulder stock, or retractable shoulder stock, you can make it fit a shorter person or a larger person. There's one of the California district court judges who said, yes, that's exactly why they're banned, because it makes it more accurate and easier to use. Oh, so we should be requiring guns to be designed that are inaccurate. Like, why don't we ban sights? Or why don't we require crooked barrels? What lunacy.
So courts have been upholding bans on AR-type rifles, so-called assault weapons, based on the rationale that the weapons represent a dramatic technological change that the founders could have never envisioned and can thus be treated differently than other commonly possessed weapons today. Were there repeating arms when the Second Amendment was ratified in 1791?
Uh, there were repeating arms, so to speak, not necessarily firearms that much. So there were repeating firearms that went back 2 and maybe even 300 years. They were more experimental. Um, Although a guy named Joseph Belton designed a firearm that would shoot, I think, 12, maybe 15 times, and he exhibited it to the Continental members of the Continental Congress, who recommended that they purchase it, but it turned out it was too expensive and it never got off the ground. There were in the mid 1700s, actually, there were firearm designs that were shown and exhibited in Boston. And so they existed. And when we get to the early Republic, we've got guns like the air gun that went on the expedition out west to discover the New World, and it shot, I think, maybe 22 times or something like that. And you could almost say it had a silencer because it was very quiet. So, but if you look at a different historical perspective, you had during the Revolution, you had some of the Indian tribes that were allied with the British, and the same with the French and Indian War. And once you fired your musket, you might be attacked by Indians immediately with bows and arrows that could shoot really fast. And so if you look at it in a different way, there's always been repeating arms. I mean, you could get off a skilled Native American could get off numerous arrows in a minute. And you can take that technology back even further to the wars between the English and the French. And you got the English bowman. That was the assault weapon of its day. It was so powerful, and the arrows could be so deadly. So it's a matter of technological perspective and difference. Technology develops, But to say that there's some kind of fundamental change in human society because of semi-automatic rifles, that would not be the case. I mean, the design started becoming popular at the beginning of the 20th century, and they've become even more popular since then for sporting use, collecting, self-defense, and so on. It's just a question of arms evolve over time, like the Supreme Court said in Heller. We have modern ways of communication, and we're not limited to the printing presses of 1791. By the same token, there's modern firearms, and the test for whether they're protected by the Second Amendment is whether they're commonly possessed by law-abiding people, and certainly they are.
You provided some very helpful research in one, I think, two respects. First of all, John Cookson. So John Cookson he published a newspaper article advertisement in Boston in, I think, 1756, saying that there's a rifle made repeating, I don't know if it was a rifle, repeating arm that could shoot 9 consecutive shots, made by John Cookson, sold at his house. And I'm not sure if you've seen this, but there's been some push from anti-gun, I'll call them scholars, saying there's a couple different theories that John Cookson didn't even really exist, or that rifle was made by John Cookson. There was a innovative, kind of famous English John Cookson gunsmith that lived a little bit before this time, and that Harold Peterson, who's done a ton of great writing, like yourself, on the history of firearms, he thinks it's a relative that lived in America. But in any event, they say, oh, that wasn't made in America. That must have been made by the English John Cookson. And so there's been some dispute over that. And you provide very good evidence that not only was John Cookson, I mean, it seems pretty evident that he says it's being sold at my house. Seems pretty evident that he existed, but you provide a great background on him. And not only that he existed, lived in Boston, but that he was a gunsmith. And so that's very helpful.
And
Oh,
he
and then
exhibited to other inhabitants there, I think, including some Indians. And so it really, I mean, the historical evidence is there for it. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the registry of people who turned in their guns to General Gage in 1775, when they were confiscated from the people of Boston, I think there were a couple of Cookson's sons that had I think they inherited his gunsmithing tools, and I think maybe they were listed as turning in guns as well.
yes, I believe that's right. You mentioned several barrels, several different parts of firearms. It seems parts that he didn't get around to building into a complete firearm yet. So clearly he had the know-how and again existed. So that's very helpful. And then I found it interesting. You mentioned that Joseph Belton, who, as you mentioned, had agreed to sell these weapons, these repeating arms, to the Continental Congress, and then it fell apart because he demanded too much money. And I knew during the war, he got disgruntled, went over to England and sold some over there. But you mentioned that he actually came up with this during the French and Indian War about 20 years prior, and was trying to sell them around that time. So that's brand new information to me. So
The technology was, you could liken it to a Roman candle. You would have charges that would go throughout the barrel. You would have one barrel, and you'd have multiple rounds loaded, and each round would have a hole through it. And so when you fired the first round in the front, then that would ignite the next one, and then the third one, and so on. And that's why they would just fire continuously.
And so another argument that anti-gun governments have been using in cases, they say that firearms weren't that common in the founding era. So we've seen this, for example, in like waiting period cases. They'll say, sure, waiting periods didn't exist in the founding era, but that's only because there was no need, because firearms weren't really available. There was a very common phrase that keeps coming up is there was no guns R us. Were firearms difficult to find around the founding?
Look, at like everything else, there were scarcities, but there was also tremendous demand for them. And by the time of the founding, let's say the period between the Revolution and 1791, when the Second Amendment and other parts of the Bill of Rights were adopted, You have accounts from founding writers talking about in the country, every man has a gun. And we know ever since America was settled by the English, um, every able-bodied man was required to be in the militia and to provide his own arms. And so, yeah, there were times when that was not complied with by everybody, but that was the legal mandate. And if you just take samples, Patrick Henry would go to school. He would take his gun and go hunting afterwards. John Adams was the same. And so guns were so commonplace, and the idea that would justify a modern waiting period. I mean, you could get a gun if you found somebody, a gunsmith who would sell it. You could get it obviously when you paid for it. And so guns were very common. That reminds me, there was a book by Michael Belle back in, it's been 20 years ago, I guess now, and he made that claim. He said that actually the Americans hated guns. They didn't want guns. They weren't very efficient. But Indians were really good with guns, and they had lots of guns. And then it was found out, and he was a professor at Emory University. It was discovered that he made up his sources. I knew the thing was fishy when I first flipped through the book, and I saw phrases that were completely misquoted. Um, and so he got all these awards, and then the awards had to be rescinded. He lost his job. Now he's a bartender, and maybe that's a better occupation for him. Although I'd be suspicious if I ordered something. I guess. I mean, look, the guy was a fraud, and this idea that the Americans didn't have many guns. I mean, guns were very desirable commodities, and they got as many as they could.
Provide a great quote from, it's a letter from William Tudor to Samuel Adams in 1774, explaining that 5,000 guns had been sold within the last month out of Boston. And at the time, I remember Richard Frothingham, if I'm saying his name right, he was a Boston historian. He focused on Boston. He lived in the early to mid 1800s. And he wrote that around 1774, the population, it had gone through a decline and then eventually increased pretty quickly. But around that time, the population was like 6,500 people, including men, women, and children. So that's a gun for every man, woman, and child. I mean, a lot of these were sold into the countryside. It wasn't just Bostonians loading up on firearms, but that clearly shows that there were a lot of gun sales. If the number of sales in 1 month almost matches the number of inhabitants of the town.
There were diaries kept in those days, and there was one diary by a businessman that I used as a resource when the Boston Tea Party was about to happen. All the handguns were sold out in Boston. And when you go further up to 1774, the Bostonians were buying as many guns as they could, and also people in the rest of the county, and they were taking them out in the countryside because they were getting ready to defend themselves. And 1775 comes around. General Gage's soldiers start seizing guns and ammunition, even though there was no legal prohibition on them. It was lawless. But he knew what the Americans were up to. They were getting as many guns as they could. And then after decades of thinking that the names of the people who turned in their guns after Lexington and Concord, when General Gage told the people of Boston, you have to turn your guns in, I actually finally found a list of the names and of the guns that were turned in. Muskets were listed as guns. Then there were pistols. There were a few blunderbusses. There were many bayonets, and it's got the names. So Paul Revere is on there, but it was Paul Revere Jr. because Paul Sr. was out in the countryside with the other rebels, getting ready to fight the British after Lexington and Concord. So Frothingham got his data from those lists of people who had turned guns in, and he found it was. And don't forget this too. Most people probably didn't turn in the best stuff. I mean, if you look at these so-called gun buybacks today, a lot of people are turning in junk, and that happened look, I wrote a book called Gun Control in Nazi-Occupied France. people turned in guns then, and they weren't their best guns. They were registered in some cases. So okay, here's my gun, and they buried the other ones. And so I always suspected that a lot of Bostonians kept their guns, hid them for another day. And one more point, Gage promised that when you turn your gun in, it will be carefully kept, and your name, they've got your name and the gun identified. But when the British finally abandoned Boston, and that was a year or two later, they destroyed all those guns. That they weren't going to let the inhabitants have their guns back. So much for registration and confiscation, and why Americans are against registration.
Yeah, and as I recall, that created an uproar throughout all the colonies at the time. The story of what had happened in Boston, the confiscation, and then refusal to live up to his end of the bargain, return the firearms.
Yeah, the initial bargain was we'll let you leave Boston if you turn your guns in, because people were, food was short. The British soldiers were oppressing the inhabitants, so you wanted to get out of Boston the best you could. And so where he broke his word was he turned in your gun, and they were supposed to be kept by the Boston Selectmen, their own governing council, but then the British troops seized them. But then he wouldn't live up to his word, and the people were not allowed to leave Boston. And so that was cited in the Declaration of Causes of Taking Up Arms by the Continental Congress in 1775 as being the perfidy that General Gage had executed upon the colonists.
So you make us going back to the kind of advancements in technology and this argument that the founders could have never envisioned this. You make a very compelling point about states enacting constitutions with the right to keep and bear arms throughout the 19th century and even up until 2014, I believe it is, in Missouri. Can you elaborate on that and what the significance is of that?
Well, in terms of constitutional rights keeping up with technology, you have the original 13 colonies, and then you have Vermont, and that was admitted as a state. That made 14. And next was Kentucky, and I think maybe Tennessee was after that. And so during this period, you have the technological improvements in the firearms industry. And finally, we get to Samuel Colt and repeating pistols or revolvers. And this whole period, the republic keeps getting bigger, and these new states, by and large, are putting the right to bear arms in their bills of rights, their state declarations of rights. And when they said arms, they were talking about the arms of their time. And so if you go to, some of the states that were admitted a little bit later, Ohio and Kansas and then westward expansion, and then you go to the last constitutional amendment, which I think was Missouri, and that's in our own century. They're talking about the guns that exist. And so I've always thought that was a significant aspect of the fact, when Heller said, what are arms today, or the technological descendants of what were arms at the founding. And by the same token, many of these state constitutions were being adopted at times when the arms were what we have now, basically. I mean, Alaska and Hawaii, those were the last states admitted, and that was in the 50s. So semi-automatics have been around for, decades before that.
Yeah, that's, I think, a great point. Next, I'd like to ask about the civilian marksmanship program. So you write a lot about the benefits in the book about AR-style rifles for militia-type purposes, kind of defending the community, if it comes to it, defending the nation. And you explain that going back to the Uniform Militia Act in 1792, and really through the early colonial days, all the way up through the 20th century, the government has always mandated or at least encouraged the citizenry to be familiar and trained with firearms. in the early 20th century, you write the older militia acts were repealed and the civilian marksmanship program was established. Can you please describe what that program was?
Right. If you go back to the Militia Act of 1792, every able-bodied white male citizen, or person rather, not citizen, aged between I think 18 and 42 or 43, was required to get his own firearm and to enroll in the militia. That was not enforced all that much. And when we get to the early 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt in particular had quite an interest in promoting an armed population, a country of riflemen. And if you go back to 1871, of course, we had the origin of the National Rifle Association, which promoted rifle marksmanship. And so what Roosevelt initiated was the idea that there would be a civilian marksmanship program, there would be a director of civilian marksmanship, and the military itself would open up their ranges to civilians. Military rifles were at first they were loaned, and then by the 1920s they were being sold to civilians. These were the standard bolt action rifles, basically the technology from World War One, and over the decades, the M1 Garand starts to be used frequently in the CMP or civilian marksmanship program. And finally, we get to I don't know the exact year they started using it, but it became like three main guns that were used: the M1 Garand, the M14 type or the civilian version, the M1A, and then the AR-15. And so those were the three types of rifles because of their military significance that the marksmanship program has wanted civilians to train with. And so we have the national matches. Nowadays, there's many more types of events with many other kinds of firearms, but the mainstay of the program, I mean, the really hardcore of it is the idea that American people who may be in service or who may, for whatever reason, become needed in emergencies, we want to have a society where many parts of the population are familiar with firearms and are able to use them to protect themselves, their communities from invasion, riot, and even self-defense. And so that program is in full force today.
You write in the book that I think from the 50s, the 1950s to 60s, they were the civilian marksmanship program was selling something like 100,000 firearms per year to the general public. What I think the gun control groups today would call military style firearms. I mean, they were weapons that had been used in the military, unlike the AR-15. So this idea that the government's very concerned about the citizenry having adequate weapons is seems to be pretty modern concern. So
well, the anti-gun people tried to kill the program. They've tried to do it many times. In the 1960s, there was an effort to do that. And if you look in the record, the hearings on what became the Gun Control Act of 1968, you'll find letters from generals and President Eisenhower and others who in World War II were praising the National Rifle Association for their work in training young men who were going to be sent abroad for the war. You have praises for the civilian marksmanship program, so it was not killed. Only in the 1990s, it was shifted from being an official U.S. military program to being a private corporation, but which is supported by the federal government. And so, for example, even to this very day, you have the importation of M1 Garands that went to Korea and other allies where they're no longer in use, and they're being imported them back into the U.S. For sale through the CMP program. And so, and don't forget, George C. Patton called the M1 Garand the finest battle implement ever invented. It shoots the 30-06 cartridge. It's very powerful. You want to call it an assault weapon? Well, it's not one, but it's certainly a battle rifle, and it's something that the United States law to this very day promotes civilians learning to use.
So I guess we should get to the federal assault weapon ban. Um, from I think it went into effect September of 1994. Could you please provide a summary of that and its effectiveness in reducing crime?
Well, it had no effect on reducing crime. It didn't do that. Um, Crime had been decreasing somewhat at the time it passed, and it defined a so-called assault weapon as having two features. There was a short list of features like the horrible, frightening, protruding pistol grip. I have to laugh when I think about they say this is such a monstrous invention. And of course, it's just a certain way that you hold the rifle. It's still just a rifle. Um, but so what that law did though, it grandfathered all the existing so-called assault weapons. And and also the features that it banned, it had to have two features. And so you had companies kept making this basically the same rifles, but with one less feature, like take the bayonet lug off. And so, yeah, crime went down somewhat because it was going down already, and it continued to go down. Um, None of this had anything to do with the ban. The ban lasted 10 years. It expired, and there were government studies saying that, well, really, we can't say the ban had anything to do with any reduction in crime. But what I did want to say preliminarily, this bills to ban so-called assault weapons were going on in Congress uh, starting in 1989 up through 1994 when the law passed. And those who were proponents of the legislation, by and large, argued that the Second Amendment does not protect individual rights. We can ban these rifles, mostly rifles. There were a few pistols and shotguns too, but mostly rifles. We can ban them because there's no individual right to keep and bear arms. And so the law expired in 2004. It lasted 10 years and it was not reenacted by Congress. Everyone knew it was just a sop. It was not something that did anything good for anybody. And then 2008, Heller comes along, and guess what? It's Second Amendment's an individual right, and commonly possessed arms are protected. So I don't think, I mean, today, of course, it's a political issue. It hasn't been readopted. Nothing like it has been reenacted, and we have to hope it stays that way.
One thing that I did not know about, which I found very interesting, was you discussed the ATF's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives forward trace program that led up to the assault weapon ban. Can you please describe what that was?
So once the ATF was basically tasked with finding reasons to ban so-called assault weapons, um, there was political support for doing that, and particularly during the Clinton administration when the ban bills became more realistic. Um, ATF traces firearms. The Gun Control Act, as amended by the Firearms Owners Protection Act, says that ATF may trace firearms in the course of bona fide criminal investigations. Um, so that normally would happen when, like, a local law enforcement officer finds a gun, which may have been at a crime scene, maybe what it wasn't, because guns are traced for lots of reasons. They're not necessarily traced to solve a crime. Like if you know A shoots B and they catch A immediately and they have his gun, tracing the gun doesn't do anything to solve the crime. Um, so normally though you go from the local law enforcement to up the chain. You go to the manufacturer or importer, and that tells you you give them the serial number and the model and all that. And then manufacturer tells you who they sold it to, a distributor maybe, and then down to the retail um, dealer. And then the retail dealer can show ATF the identity of the person who bought the firearm. And so that's normal tracing. Forward tracing was a different program that was specifically generated to make it look like certain kinds of selected guns were traced more than others. And so what ATF did was to inspect local dealers' records and start tracing guns where there was no nexus with any law enforcement objective. And so you had a buildup of statistics of guns that were artificially traced. And then they could say, oh, look at all the AR-15s that we traced. Or there were certain handguns on the list. I think maybe one of the SIG guns and really high quality pistols. So they built up this data, which they said, oh, look at all these guns that have been traced. And it was all a ruse. We did a little bit of litigation. It didn't come to a complete resolution, but it was basically a government program to generate statistics of tracing, which meant nothing. Because then they would say, oh, tracing means guns seized at crime scenes. That wasn't the case at all.
And that same tracing info is often used in some of these. For example, Mexico is suing a lot of the most popular American firearm manufacturers, accusing it of being responsible for crime caused by drug cartels in Mexico, and they rely on that same trace data to say. So it's trace data is unreliable for a variety of reasons, which I won't bother getting into here. But it's interesting that it's also susceptible to such abuse and was abused to end up trying to justify the assault weapon ban.
Yeah, so look, Mexico, Estados Unidos de Mexico, they turn over the American-made guns for ATF to trace. They're not going to, the guns smuggled in from North Korea or wherever the heck they come from, they're not going to give ATF that information to trace. They can't trace it. And so the whole thing is, once again, it's an artificial program meant to denigrate the very legitimate industry.
So my final question is: you've been quite prescient in selecting topics for books. You had the Founders' Right. Was it the Founders' Right to
The Founders' Second Amendment.
Founders' Second Amendment? I'm sorry.
Yes.
I actually have, since I stumbled over that, I'll just let you know. I actually have 3 copies of that because I marked up the first 2 so much. I marked up one so much I had to get a second. Marked up that one so much. So you think I'd remember the name, but anyway, that was published right around the time the Supreme Court was deciding District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008, which focused on the original understanding of the right. And then right, I seem to think that you published the right to bear arms right as the Supreme Court, I think, agreed to hear the Bruin case.
Yes, that's right.
Which was perfect timing. Bruin, of course, involved the right to carry. And I should mention that was an NRA case because that's not well enough known. So anyway, I was excited when I saw that you wrote a book on AR style rifles because I thought maybe that's going to mean that we will see the Supreme Court take up a case on one of these assault weapon bans. Do you think we'll be seeing one of those cases anytime soon?
That's yet to be seen, and it's hazardous to predict what the Supreme Court's going to do. But probably the main criteria that the Supreme Court uses when they decide to take a case is whether the circuit courts of appeals are in dispute. So are there interpretations of a law going one way and the opposite another way, and therefore the Supreme Court needs to resolve it. But the problem with this issue for at least circuits in conflict is that these laws are only enacted in a handful of states that are basically anti-gun states. And the judges in those states, even the federal judges, by and large, reflect that same sentiment, no matter who appoints them. I mean, and there's a lot of exceptions to that. And I mean, there's judges appointed by Clinton who went against Maryland's assault weapon ban, for example. But by and large, there's a kind of a culture in those states, and therefore it's hard to get a circuit conflict. Look, Texas hasn't banned assault weapons, and therefore you won't get a Fifth Circuit decision invalidating that ban that would be in conflict with, say, the Ninth Circuit, which rubber stamps every gun ban of every type. And so if the Supreme Court takes a case, there are several cases working their way through the lower courts now, and the Supreme Court has an interest in the issue because after Bruin, it did send one of the so-called assault weapon cases back to the Court of Appeals for reconsideration in light of Bruin. There were at least 2 magazine ban cases of the same type. So, I mean, and we know that the court's interested in those issues. But these cases need to go through the percolating process of final decisions on the merits, not just injunctive motions. There needs to be judgments, final judgments after trial. And that's what's going on in the courts now. I hope the court will take up that issue. I think they will eventually. It's hard to say when, but it's so obvious that what the court has said, particularly in Heller and then Bruin, about the constitutional protection for commonly possessed guns or guns that are typically possessed for lawful purposes. There's just no question. I mean, this is the most common type of firearm in our country. People keep making the analogy to F-150 Fords, but there's a lot more AR-15s than F-150 Fords. That's the most popular truck nationwide, I think. So we'll see what the court does, but I think the recent Rahimi case doesn't hurt the Second Amendment. I mean, what the court did was a very narrow ruling where you had to have a court reach a finding that a person is a credible threat to the physical safety of another person. I know many of us took different positions on that law, but the bottom line is that the Rahimi case is not what the anti-Second Amendment people wished it was going to be. And so, say la vie, we'll see what happens in the future, but I'm optimistic about what the court will do.
I agree. I am too. They haven't had a final judgment ruling, like you mentioned, since Bruin on one of these cases. So I'm hoping once they finally do, we'll get them to decide it. So where can people find your work?
Well, everywhere. I'm going to flash my copy too. I guess most people get books from Amazon and mail order outfits nowadays, but I won't say anywhere books are sold because that's not accurate, but I don't know how many bookstores there are anymore either. But Amazon, wherever you like to buy your books. If you don't like Amazon, you can easily get it somewhere else. It's called The America's Rifle, The Case for the AR-15. And my name is Stephen Halbrook, and I have a website, stephenhalbrook.com. I have a number of other books that, if you're interested in that book, you might be interested in some of the other Second Amendment books.
Yeah, and I can, for what my opinion's worth, they are very, very worth it. I've been reading and relying on and borrowing your stuff for a long time. So very grateful for all your work and very grateful for you coming on today. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Joseph. Look forward to doing more of this in the future, and I look forward to your subsequent visitors to your program.